Cool. All right, Doug. So I'm excited to ask you these questions because I think that there's a lot of, um, like when I go through things on the internet about for men, it seems like there's a lot of Christian men sites or like accounts or things like that, especially for Black men too. It seems like there's a lot that that men, a lot of like these sites use religion to talk about men, and it seems like the majority of them are somewhat problematic in how they talk about masculinity, and they do it to like in the sense of like the man should like watch over the woman, and they just kind of like they reintroduce or like just support like traditional gender roles. It's mostly about being traditional, and some try to put a modern spin on it, but at the core of it is still that the man is a stronger one and the leader of the house. So I'm curious. So I'm going to ask you this. So that's what I'm here to ask you about. Um, I want to start with just asking you, like, what has Christianity taught you about being a man?
That's a very complex question. I guess a very complex answer. Christianity as we know it in the United States is highly patriarchal. And that's one of the great heresies of American Christianity. Because, Christianity came out of a very patriarchal society, Mideast around 2000 years ago, that was a very patriarchal society. But what American Christianity has done is imported that culture, but not imported the actual teachings of Jesus. Jesus rebelled mightily against the patriarchy of the society. When he was asked by the Pharisees, if they could divorce their wives, just put her aside, because that's what Moses said. Well, yeah, that was the old patriarchal model, that women were essentially property and the men could do whatever they wanted with their wives. And Jesus said that women and men have equal rights. It's a very bold, clear statement that he absolutely dismisses the most fundamental tenets of patriarchy and says, no, male and female are equal. They're one flesh. When they get married, it's one flesh. And they have equal, I'm interpreting, but they have equal rights and responsibilities to one another. But, American Christianity, just like America does with most things, does whatever it wants with it and turns it into whatever it wants it to be. And so it has become for the most part, a very patriarchal institution, American religion. So I suppose that I was influenced in that in many ways, around sexual orientation, around gender. It helped me to go to seminary at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, because they had a very strong analysis. I met the strongest feminists that I had ever met in my life up to that point at seminary, and really for the first time was being confronted around patriarchy. And okay, Becky's going out for a walk. So that was probably my introduction to feminism, was in seminary. And at that time, feminism was very strong in some of the early days of feminism in Christianity, and it was very strong and vibrant. So that was huge. I also we had a lot of LGBTQ folks in our seminary, and that was also very helpful in helping me to confront the distortions that American Christianity has when it comes to sexual orientation. So that was an advantage for me. And so from the beginning, my formation around understanding Christianity was helping to, to confront and challenge the patriarchy that was there. But, I mean, it's so subtle and so deep in the culture and so immersed in everything that we do and say and, attitudes that, I would say that it still has had a patriarchalizing influence on me as well.
What was it like when you started learning about feminism in seminary after you had been sort of like in the church for so long? Did it challenge your perception of the church, or did it deepen your connection to the spirit? Like, how did that affect your faith?
I would say it deepened my connection to my faith. Growing up in church, I had a very kind of benevolent patriarchal upbringing in the church. All the ministers I knew were men, white men. I was the president of the youth group, and the secretary was a woman who basically did all the work. And, so that, it was all very friendly and very patriarchal and very unequal. And, but I knew that it was not right. I had an instinct that this is not right. And so I found the challenges in seminary very helpful, very deep. And I had many long conversations with women about, the meaning of faith and the damage that patriarchy does to male-female relationships and to human relationships in general. So I would say, and then of course I met Becky in seminary, and she is a very strong woman who has from day one made it clear that, there would be no disrespect between us. And so that relationship has been very healthy and helpful for me. And that's something we've had to work through. And she has, been very clear about her, the ways that it needs to be between us. And, I think a lot of times when you get married, you tend to bring what you have seen in your family growing up into your marriage unconsciously. And so we had to kind of battle some of that out and work some of that out and come to our own understanding of what our relationship was going to be.
Yeah. It's interesting. It sounds like you it's like your faith was sort of transformed by like a feminist ideology, by feminist lens, and then your wife kind of like Becky made it like, I guess, concrete in your life.
Yes, very concrete in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I just want to ask this question. I can guess the answer, but do you think, is patriarchy a sin?
Yes.
Like, give me a preacherly answer for why. Because I get the sense, I'm going to put this stuff out and people are going to, the kind of folks, people might like, the question this kind of stuff. So like, what's like a biblical justification for that?
Well, from a Christian perspective, there have been periods in the development of biblical religion when patriarchy has been a central foundation. But I think Jesus made it very abundantly clear that patriarchy was not acceptable in in the way he responded to the question around marriage, in the way he dealt with women, in the way that it was, when all the men deserted at the end during the crucifixion, it was only the women who were left. The women were the ones who, encountered the risen Christ for the first time and had to share that with the men. The men, of course, didn't believe him at first. And so, the development, and then early on, the men kind of eased the women out of the picture, even though they had been that central transition force with the resurrection. But, patriarchy does great harm to human beings. And, I think like racism and like, heterosexism and other forms of oppression, patriarchy is to be done away with. When Jesus talks about in the 4th chapter of Luke, where he says, I've come to share good news with the poor, to bring liberty to the captives, to free all who are oppressed. That would clearly include women who have been, subjected to a patriarchal system. And you see it throughout his ministry. I mean, he does not adhere to the rules of the patriarchal game, and he's constantly being challenged on that. Why are you talking to this Samaritan woman? In the encounter he has with the Syrophoenician woman, she challenges him and he agrees with her. The woman who anointed him, the disciples were all upset. And he says, this woman, wherever the gospel is told, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. So, at all the critical moments, you just see that Jesus has a very anti-patriarchal stance and confronts patriarchy and embraces and gives thanks for the women who are bold and strong enough to challenge it. He appreciates them constantly. The woman with the flow of blood who reached out and touched him, he lifts her up as a model for healing.
Yeah, it's true. I was wondering, sometimes I think of if Jesus was around today, what would we call someone who did the kind of things that he did? And I wonder if if you would agree that do you think Jesus was queer? Today, in today's parlance, would he have been categorized that way?
Maybe. It's hard to know, because one of the challenges of moving from 2,000 years ago to today is that the categories are different. The understandings of queerness and, just aren't the same now as they didn't really, I don't know that was even understood in the same kind of way back then. But if you look at the fact that most men were married, a lot of his disciples were married, and Jesus was not married, that there would be a queerness in that. There are certain passages that you could interpret. For example, when there's a lot of talk about John being the disciple that Jesus loved, and there's no real understanding about what does that mean? We don't know. We know he was, we don't even know that he wasn't married for sure, but the understanding is that he wasn't married. But otherwise, we don't really know anything about his sexuality, his sexual orientation, it seems that he was pretty close with Mary Magdalene. It seems that he was close with Mary and Martha. He seems that he was particularly close with John. He was also particularly close with Peter, but we don't really know the full nature of those relationships.
It's interesting to me that such a man like that, a person like that, has become the figurehead of such a patriarchal institution.
Yeah.
how I'm curious is like, I think we can guess like why, because it was used as a form of power. But like, what do you think can be done to sort of reclaim it, to reclaim that image of Jesus, or like to to make the to make the church not more represent accurately the kind of teachings that he had?
Well, I think we have to dismantle the structures that have been set up around him that have falsified what he's about. Almost from the beginning, it's not that different from what society has done with uh, you know, Martin Luther King or others. It's like society creates people into their own image that makes them into what they want them to be. Almost from the beginning, the early church began to form and began to dismiss the women's perspective. The Gospel of Mary had a very important perspective, had a very different kind of understanding of the whole post-resurrection period, where Jesus and Mary had a lot of intimate conversations, and the patriarchy quickly took over and simply dismissed the Gospel of Mary and other writings that might have given a different perspective. Thunder Perfect Mind and some of the other, so you've got to go back and reconstruct what actually happened. By the 300s, this underground radical movement has been co-opted by the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor decides that he's now a Christian. He starts appointing bishops and kind of takes over the church, and it becomes this Roman church, which eventually becomes the exact opposite of what it was, that it was supposed to be. Begins to, become a colonizing force, begins to become an imperial violence force, begins to become a white supremacist force when, Jesus is not just a patriarchal man. Jesus is white in America, and that's absolutely ridiculous. The only it's a story of people of color in living under the oppression of an empire, and yet all of a sudden now it's kind of the imperial religion. It's utterly distorted from what the Gospels tell us who Jesus was. So I think we've got to go back to the Gospels themselves. We got to understand them within their social and political context. And a lot of people, for example, want to use that story about Jesus saying, being questioned about marriage, and him saying, that a man and woman shall marry and they shall become one. They want to use that as an anti-gay thing, which is just absurd, because the Pharisees asked him a very specific question about male-female marriage, patriarchal marriage. That was their question. It was about what's permitted under patriarchal male-female marriage. They asked a very specific question. He gave them a very specific answer, that the patriarchy is a nightmare. It needs to be abolished. Male and female need to be equal in that kind of relationship. He's not saying anything about same-sex marriage or anything else. He's answering that specific question. So I think if we, just go back and look at what's actually there and look at it within its context, then we can reconstruct who Jesus actually is and, kind of differentiate that from the imperial Jesus that America has created.
What responsibility do you think that Christian men have in that project, and like in undoing the situation?
Oh, I think Christian men have, should be taking a leadership role in doing that. I mean, I'm very interested in in some of the kind of work you are doing, and some of the other men that are coming together to really examine what patriarchy looks in our lives. I'm really interested to hear more about, I've actually talked to some men who are a part of your men's group
Oh,
who are
cool.
really benefiting from it and appreciating it a lot. So that to me sounds like a really good model, where men kind of come together and do some work themselves and encourage each other, strengthen each other to develop, new perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is to get people together, get men together to do the work amongst each other. And I'm learning that like the most important thing is for men to be present with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Men to be present, like period. Like oftentimes a lot of men go through life and they're not present. They're somewhere else, or they're avoiding something, or um oh yeah, many layers of avoidance. Um but when they become present, I think that unlocks a lot of um the power of like what masculinity can be. It's like that's how you come through with it. We had a session last night about the gifts of men,
Mm.
and and the and as I was like listening and thinking, because I always leave like a little message at the end to like summarize things. And what came to me was that like the gift that we have, the gift that all of us give, like all the things that people mentioned, is presence,
Mm.
and that's what we do. I mean, that's what we can do. It's like it's presence on many levels. It's being present to yourself so that you can understand what you have to give, and being present to the space and where you are, so you know when to give it and how to give it. Um, and I think that Jesus was a good example of that.
Mm.
I think if you think about like if he was as powerful as a divine being can be, he could have done a lot of crazy stuff. You know, if he could walk on water and make feed 1,000 people with bread and fish, then he could also probably like snap his fingers and stop somebody's heart. But that wasn't what Jesus did. And Jesus did the things that were necessary to the moment,
Mm.
um, and shared the gifts that were necessary, and didn't do too much, in that sense. Um, I was wondering, well, I think I'm wondering about the Bible. I think a lot of people are afraid of reading the Bible or avoid it because of the the level of like oppression that comes through it. Do you feel like the Bible is like would you say the Bible is a patriarchal document?
Well, the Bible is 66 books written over a period of thousands of years. So it's such a collection of documents. Um, I've been reading through some of the early uh, books like um, Joshua and Judges and First Samuel. And yeah, it's super patriarchal, very violent. It's basically just warrior culture trying to, knock off this group and that group, and, trying to assert your strength by means of the sword. And, David was a great king because, he was a great warrior. That was his claim to the throne. Um, and he was, not very enlightened when it came to relationships with women. His relationships with women were horrific. He Bathsheba, I guess, is one of the most famous, but he saw her bathing and just asked his servants to come bring her to him. Then she gets pregnant and he sends her husband to the front lines in battle and sends a message to then have the troops pull back so he'll get killed. This was the
Yeah.
nature of the enlightenment of the king at that point. But then, when you get to, I think, there's certainly a lot of wisdom all the way through at different places, even in the book of Genesis, the first chapter, that talks about God created them, male and female. God created them in God's image. God created them, male and female. So there's, there is a sense from the beginning that there's an equality of male and female. But, then the next chapter, you've got the Garden of Eden, and you've got, all the mythology that has come out of that in its interpretation. The prophets challenged the perspective of the patriarchy in many ways. There's some strong women that band together. The book of Ruth, the book of Esther, women standing up to, answer the call of God to be strong. And then the Gospels, I think, are a great example of confronting patriarchy. So I think you've got the full, sweep within the. One of the things I do like about the Bible is that there's an honesty in telling the history. It would be great if the United States had an honest history instead of a glorified myth, that glosses over brutality of the, conquering of the land from the native people and the, enslavement of folks from Africa. All that stuff is glossed over in U.S. history. We don't want to look at it. And at least in the biblical history, there's an honest record of the, I don't know what all to call it, but there's a certain level of honesty in the telling of history.
It's like warts and all.
Warts and all. There's some definite warts in there.
Yeah. I'm curious what's your approach when people use the Bible to uphold patriarchy and oppression? Do you go like one-on-one with them, like verse for verse, or like how would you recommend people approach that?
Yeah, I don't find the word for word, verse for verse battle to be very effective generally. People just kind of get dug in their perspective, and there's enough verses in the Bible that most anybody can find pretty much whatever they want to say, whatever they want. So, there's plenty of material there. You've got to kind of get a sense of the whole of the story and the way Jesus confronts the narrative and really turns over the narrative. And not that Jesus is 100% unique. Jesus comes in the way of the prophets, and there were a lot of biblical prophets that were also confronting the system. But I think Jesus probably took it a few steps further in a lot of different areas, in the area of social justice and economic justice and gender justice. And I really like that image you were using of presence, as a real gift of men, because I would say that's a nice way to look at what Jesus brought in. There was a real presence, a willingness to listen, a willingness to engage people, not out of a, desire to control, but really, the woman who comes with a flow of blood, and she reaches out and touches the hem of his garment, and she gets healed, and he feels the healing. And so he invites her into a conversation and really appreciates her courage in reaching out and, across that boundary that she wasn't supposed to cross, and then really lifts her up as a model. A lot of times he says, your faith has made you well. So he's being a presence, he's being a witness. He's not necessarily snapping his fingers and, making someone well, but he's honoring the faith that he sees in people. He sees God in people. He sees goodness in people, and he invites them to fully live into that goodness. So I think that presence is a great word to explore more about, how can men be more present? And I think it really does speak to one of the great problematic challenges for men is that we do get shut down. We kind of just go into this denial place and we're not even present to ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a great image and model for moving forward.
Thanks. I think that makes me think about church and prayer and like what it means to call down the presence of Jesus, and like to that feeling when it's around, like the feeling like the spirit,
Yeah.
and how it opens up things. It doesn't like I want to say that it doesn't necessarily add something outside from the situation, but it like grows the things that are already there,
Yeah, that's a great image. You think about, after Jesus left, after, ascended and told the disciples, just stay together and wait for the Spirit. Wait for the Spirit. The Spirit is coming, stay. And so they stayed together. They were in prayer together. And then when the Spirit came, it opened up all these new channels for the Spirit to move. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old people will dream dreams, and your young people will see visions. All of a sudden, everybody begins to speak in every language on earth, so that all the people who are gathered are able to hear in their own native tongue. Talk about an experience of the presence of the Spirit, just opening up the fullness of human interaction. Beautiful.
Yeah. I want to talk about resurrection as well. And if you could say a little bit about like how men specifically can use the idea of resurrection to, I guess, to transform, to become and to transform into something more present.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I guess moving out of patriarchy is a kind of death, in the sense that we have been so immersed in that from the time we were children, told that we shouldn't cry, told that we should man up, told that we should push down our feelings, all that kind of thing. So, by the time you're, old like we are, that stuff is soaked in for a long time. So yeah, I suppose there's a kind of a death and a life. I guess the gospel doesn't speak about death so much as an end, but more as a transformation. And I think it's a powerful image for how, the disciples don't even recognize Jesus when he's risen.
Yeah.
They walk with him on the road to Emmaus, or they see him in the field and they think he's the gardener, or they think he's a stranger, or they don't recognize until they break bread. And then all of a sudden their eyes were open. So there's something new happening after the resurrection. They're seeing something new that they hadn't seen before. And yeah, I think that's a lot of the process of moving out of patriarchy is I love the way you're framing this, the presence and the openness, the being, kind of rising from of a dead form into a new possibilities. Yeah.
Yeah. yeah, it's like I like that, like the idea of rising out of a dead form, because when you're not in touch with yourself, it's kind of like a living death. Is you're walking around, you're moving, but you're not necessarily alive to the world. You're kind of just waiting for the next thing to happen. Um, and I think when you can give and it is like when I think of like just the passion and the resurrection, like it is a painful process. It takes to cut privilege away from yourself, um, is a process that like it's not fun, you know. It's not something that like is just you wake up one day and you're fine and like all of a sudden you're like a new person. You got to go through some stuff, and that usually involves like dealing with your trauma in your past, like learning skills that you never were asked to have, and dealing with a healthy amount of shame. And it's you know there's it's not a pretty process, just like the crucifixion was not pretty. It was a painful thing, but on the other side is this like ineffable presence, in a sense. It's this thing that's no longer limited by a body.
Right, right. Well, and that's interesting because it's so much, patriarchy is so much about control and so
Mhm.
much about, it's almost like all the energy of patriarchy is bent on not letting you get out of it. It's
Yeah,
just and um, to admit that you're not strong, in control, that you're not sure how to move forward, that you're, is yeah, it's very scary if you've counted on patriarchy to give you your sense of identity and your sense of being.
yeah. That's cool. I like that conversation. So I have only a few more questions left to ask. I guess my next question is like a more of a practical question for for male pastors. Like, what do you think pastors, male pastors specifically, can do to support their churches and congregations in addressing patriarchy?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think developing conscious men's groups that are confronting patriarchy and intentionally growing uh, are very important. And I know, you and some others were very key in that kind of pioneering that work in our church back in the Bronx.
Yeah,
And that's, I think, critically important. And I've heard that from women also, that we really need men to do their work. We need men to um, because a lot of times men go to women for their emotional support, you know, but with each other, we don't confront these issues. So, I think that could be a huge move forward, is to develop strong men's circles where, that are really conscious, not that are there to just uphold patriarchy and watch football, but, that are really there to help one another wrestle in a supportive environment with these challenges and become new.
yeah, I like that, becoming new. Um, yeah, that's something I'm thinking about with what I'm doing as well, is being able to offer this kind of work to churches and organizations, um, as a way of building their capacity around dealing with patriarchy and their issues. And to me, it's clear, like to me, it's important that it's about building capacity and not about like me coming in, doing a training, and being the expert.
Mhm.
And, like whenever if I work with a church or any place, um, I want it to be different than when I came, when it's done, to have the capacity to continue on its own afterwards.
Yeah, that's great. That's um, yeah, I mean, there's, from a typical church, there would be a lot of resistance even to doing that work or introducing that work. So I guess some of the work also has to come from, um, pastors and other church leaders who are willing to open up that space, invite that work in, um, so that we can transform as, as a community.
Yeah. All right, one more question. I have two more questions actually, but the next one is a broader question. What kind of men do you think God wants us to be?
Whole men,
Hmm.
I think God has imbued us with gifts and goodness and compassion and emotions uh, and the ability to be present. Yeah, I think God wants us to be present with people in our lives, in our families, and in our lives. I think God wants us to be present to the Spirit, um, and the possibilities that exist. To be, willing to take a risk and heal. And um, I think God wants us to be well, um, and whole.
What do you think men can do to like increase their attunement to what God wants?
Well, I guess I would go back to men's groups, but they got to be conscious men's groups, around that they're really moving toward this kind of wholeness that you've been talking about. Praying together, supporting each other. Um, I think a lot of men are lonely for authentic male companionship.
Yeah.
Some men are better than this at others, but so much of male culture centers around things like sports and cars and making money and uh, some of these more um, kind of kind of narrowly defined, and not encouraged so much to really look at ourselves and our feelings and our what we're struggling with and what our hopes are, and those kinds of things. um, so hopefully the church could be a place where we could do more of that. It could be kind of an alternative community where we could explore this other side of ourselves.
Yeah. All right. My last question. I'm trying to phrase it correctly. In a world without, if the world was like rid of patriarchy, what would church look like?
Hmm. Well, I think it would be more free to do a lot of what we've been talking about. I think there'd be, I mean, I suppose if it was free, completely free of patriarchy, then we wouldn't need to do some of the work that we're talking about. People would be more free to interact with one another beyond gender roles. We wouldn't be as concerned about, you know, what's the manly thing to do. We could be much more open to the wide expanse of what masculinity can be and femininity and everything in between and everything around that. I remember one time hearing David Morgan at New Day do a poem about elegant masculinity.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I was so struck by that term. I had never put the word elegant next to masculinity. And it just kind of opened up this image for me that masculinity doesn't have to be hard and buttoned down, that it could be, that it could be elegant. It kind of opened my mind. Wow, masculinity could be that. So I think if you kind of take some of those fetters away, there might be all kinds of things we could imagine ourselves being.
Yeah, I agree. I think the church would be way more diverse too, because people wouldn't. I think a lot of the hang-ups that people have around going to church have to do with negative experiences that stem from some kind of from some in some way from patriarchy, from either being like told, if they're women, for being told that they have to like act a certain way or be a certain way, and if they're men, or especially if they're queer men, being told that they're like going to hell, quite literally. So it's interesting, I think that like
But we do like it when you sing.
yeah, right.
We would like you to keep playing the organ for us, but yeah,
Just don't tell us
happy,
about your dating. Don't tell us
happy
about
to,
your life.
right.
Play
Happy
the
to receive
music.
the gifts, but got to keep it in this box here.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the people who would be singing would also be preaching and serving communion
Yeah.
and doing all that stuff.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, that's all my questions, Doug. Do you have anything else you want to say or add?
No, this is great. I really appreciate the work you're doing. I think your generation is moving this conversation along a little bit. It's been a long, bumpy road, so I'm really appreciative of this very important work that you're doing.
Thank you. It feels good to do. It feels like it's been a long time coming for me to put this together, and I feel like I've been preparing for this kind of thing for like my whole life, basically. So it's like every day I get up early and I do some work for this, and I spend my days really just working at making a lot of media for this stuff, but also like making these groups and thinking about how I'm going to dismantle patriarchy in a way. It's the more that I do it, the more that I realize that's what I'm doing. It's not going to happen maybe in my lifetime, but there are a lot of men who are thinking this way, and in my generation, and especially I think there's like the amount of like how the way it is, because we've grown up around feminism, that there's an awareness that this system sucks, like it's sucking the life out of us, and that there's a will towards freedom that I don't know if other generations of men, older generations of men have. Um, so it's good. I think it's the right time. I just have to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, yeah, indeed.
Yeah. All right, Doug. Thank you. Appreciate your time. You're giving me a lot to work with and think about. I'm gonna stop
Well, it's
recording now.
always